Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing really well. All of you are so special to me, and I'm so glad you're tuning in for another story. But before we start, go and get yourself that lovely drink, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight that you're going to definitely enjoy, and it certainly should put a smile on your face. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, 11-year-old Simon Miller knew he shouldn't be doing this with his 10-year-old brother James at his side, who had agreed to come here, on the condition, of course, that Simon gave him a month's worth of pocket money that was already lying in his piggy bank, that he knew his younger brother wanted extremely badly. But this intrepid nightly adventure had been more than James had bargained for, as a growing sense of unease seemed to permeate his every thought, which he tried desperately to brush away and dismiss, as worrying about things you could not see would only make him all the more fearful, so much so, in fact, that he'd likely lose his nerve and run all the way back home, which would be completely counterproductive. Simon was the older of the two boys, by about 18 months, and being the eldest, he didn't want to show his younger brother James the apprehension and disquiet he was secretly nursing. But he had known all along that this nightly adventure of theirs would be more than a little intimidating, for he had never been particularly fond of the dark. But tonight he would not allow the uncertainty that doused his mind with a burgeoning sense of trepidation to stall his plans for the night ahead. He'd been longing to do this for a couple of weeks now, and nothing could possibly go wrong tonight, or could it? It would seem making their way down the sprawling woodland paths that divided the neighbours' property from their own was about the easiest way possible to access the von Rensburg house, without being seen, of course. This rather useful shortcut of trees that proved to be very handy during the day, and was easily accessed without any concerns, had become a lot more discomposing for them at night, when the woodland oasis seemed to sing a completely different tune, for the atmosphere had dramatically changed, so much so that this benevolent grove of trees that the boys knew and loved so well wore a much more menacing demeanour, that left Simon and his brother James feeling a tad uncomfortable. James was clandestinely nursing his own anxieties, for like his brother he was afraid of the dark, and it had taken a great deal of bottle on his part to come here tonight to support his brother, even though he knew emphatically that what they were both doing was intrinsically wrong. But the idea of all that lovely extra pocket money crammed into his wallet had been an irresistible temptation that was impossible for James to refuse. He badly wanted to buy the vintage car he'd seen at the store in town, and now that there were only 2 left, it was all he could think about. So coming here, despite the fear that pressed down heavily on his heart, had not been an easy endeavour by any manner of means. But then again, nothing you really ever wanted in life came cheap. Everybody knew that, and it was one of his father's favourite sayings. Ostensibly, James was far too proud to let his older brother know that this little trip through the woods at the dead of night was proving to be a whole lot more terrifying and unnerving than he'd actually anticipated. The harrowing feeling of being watched by a pair of unseen, very menacious eyes had fed his imagination frenziedly, like a blood-sucking school of hungry piranhas. James had done his best to soothe his overactive imaginings by reassuring himself over and over again that nothing was there, but he couldn't shake off the ominously insidious feeling that they were both being watched by a pair of predatory eyes that burnt into the back of his skull like a couple of searing hot coals. He turned around nervously to stare behind him at the large labyrinth of trees that divided both properties from each other and stretched out over an expansive area of property. He was used to regularly visiting their best friend Boris von Rensburg by way of this wood grove that the boys used regularly as a convenient way of access. But at night this woodland oasis had taken on a cloyingly sinister, rather discombobulating atmosphere, which left icy cold chills running down the back of his spine, and goosebumps unabashedly breaking out all over his flesh, for the menacing ambience suffocated all feelings of calm. "Get a grip," James told himself very firmly, over and over again. "I know the woods very well. I know them so well, like the back of my hand. It's just dark in here, that's all. That's why I'm scared. But buckle up. This adventure will soon be over, and then I can forget all about it. And once it's over, I will never have to do this again. And apart from anything else, I'll be able to get that wonderful vintage car I want so badly." His reassuring words offered little in the way of solace, as pretending to feel in control of your emotions is not always easy to accomplish, as James's nerves were seeping through the cracks of his flagging confidence at a rapid pace. He held his breath for a brief moment to suppress an inward gasp. He was certain he'd seen a shadowy, ambiguous figure staring straight at him from behind a tall, lofty tree. The silhouette had peered at him rather curiously, and then just seemed to vanish from sight, and he wondered if he'd actually seen it at all. He suspected that his impressionably suggestive, fertile imagination was duplicitously playing tricks on him. He reminded himself that his brother Simon would soon be giving him a month's worth of pocket money that he'd saved up in his piggy bank at home. And when he got that money, he would definitely be able to buy that vintage sports car he liked so very much. So much that the owner of the shop, Mr. Eric Reisman, had said he only had 2 models of the specialty cars left, and that they could no longer order any more, as the vintage line was going out of production. So this car would almost certainly be a collector's piece one day, if it was looked after well enough. So it was a worthy investment. James had wanted that sports car so much that he'd even asked his mother if he could have an advance loan on his pocket money to buy it. But his mother, Janice Miller, who was not one of those mothers who gave in to her children's fanciful whims, had said absolutely not. "It doesn't work like that, James. If you want something badly enough, you need to save for it yourself." "But, Ma'am, Mr. Reisman told me that when those vintage cars are finally sold out, there will be no more produced. There's only 2 left, and they could be sold any day now." Mrs. Miller did not have much sympathy for James's plight, for she did not see the world through a young boy's eyes, and was often inclined to be tactlessly unsympathetic. "Well, that's not my problem, is it, James? You were the one that bought all those sweets last month, so it's no wonder you've got no pocket money saved up. At least your brother is more vigilant like that. If you can't afford to buy that car, it's not my problem, is it?" It would seem, for James coming here tonight had been a no-brainer. He desperately wanted that vintage car to add to his collection, and if it meant walking over hot coals or breaking into a bank vault in order to get it, he'd probably have done so. And if that was the case, he told himself firmly, why was he allowing himself to be nervous about this trek through the woods? Why should he let it intimidate him? He was used to walking in the woods during the daytime. It was during the witching hour the woodgrove was like an altogether different world to the prepossessing place it appeared to be during the day. But James told himself to focus on the path ahead, and not to allow any intrusive thoughts to filter into his imagination. But sometimes thoughts have a mind of their own, like an out-of-control bull terrier that you cannot rein in, no matter how hard you try. Finally, both boys had reached their due destination, but it wasn't over yet. They were standing in the Van Rensburg backyard, but James reminded himself that their adventure still was not complete. They still had to go back the way they'd come, so he had to brace himself for the next few harrowing minutes or so that seemed to stretch out before him like an elastic band, with no beginning and no end. By all accounts, when you were doing something you knew was not right, it seemed to make every second feel like 1,000 lifetimes that were already lived. James was terrified of confrontation of any kind, of being caught red-handed, doing something you know you shouldn't be doing, or having to account for what they'd done. He envisaged prison gates made of steel, with nasty spikes that could tear a man in half, if daring to escape. He could imagine a maximum security prison, nasty police officers with formidable glares and angry scowls, dressed in bulletproof armour, carrying mace in their hands and hefty handcuffs. He imagined dingy, oppressive prison cells, darker and more tenebrific than the woods themselves. He imagined bunk beds with holey blankets and smelly toilets. He envisaged himself wearing an orange jumpsuit. In his mind's eye he could see his mother visiting him in prison, with tears gathering in her eyes, saying, "How could you do this to me, James? I am so humiliated and so desperately embarrassed. You have completely broken my heart. I never knew you were capable of such evil." James begged the haunting flashes of a potential mortifying grim future to go away, but they kept beckoning to him. "Leave me alone," he told his thoughts. He tried to swat them away like mosquitoes, but they kept nagging at his mind. "What if you get caught?" they whispered. "What if you get caught?" "I'm not going to get caught," James screamed back at the thoughts in his head. They were here now. There was no point in backtracking on their plans. James's brother Simon appeared to be staring at the rabbit hutch for a long moment. A couple of rabbits nonchalantly tucked into a piece of carrot, and at first did not appear to notice the two shadowy figures peering into the hutch at them. All Boris's rabbits were extremely well fed and sizable, as being oversized appeared to run in the von Rensburg family, although Nina von Rensburg, Boris's tiny mother, was the exception to the rule in that regard. To all intents and purposes, it would seem Simon was caught up in a bubble of self-reflection. He was suddenly hit with an attack of the guilts, the nagging, uncomfortable reminder that warned him rather fiercely that what he was doing was not right. The words, "Thou shalt not steal," rang into his head like a resounding bell. If his mother were to see him right now, she'd be bitterly disappointed in him. He was stealing something that wasn't his to take, but he couldn't help himself. The temptation to do this was so immensely strong, there was no way he could possibly overcome it. Finally, with what seemed like a degree of wavering trepidation, accompanied by a pair of unsteady, trembling fingers, Simon hastily opened the combination lock of the rabbit hutch. Simon had seen Boris use the numbers of his birth date to get into the hutch, probably because they were numbers that his friend wouldn't forget so easily. Simon twisted the lock, turning the numbers together in a perfect sequence, and the lock clicked open. It had been that easy. The tenebrific night that stretched out before them, like an all-encompassing carpet that blasted out the light so cruelly, so that the world around them was drawn in a squiggle of dark shadows that on the landscape looked like a plethora of vague cardboard cutouts, devoid of any definition. This made the clinging atmosphere of the night stick to them like the fibres from a spider web, and it felt inauspiciously foreboding, which had been very intimidating for the two young boys, who had almost certainly lost their courage to come here tonight. But somehow their resolute determination had won through, and now there was no going back, for the script was being written in permanent marker. James hid his lack of confidence behind a brave veneer, which was the antithesis to how he had actually felt tonight. His father had once told him that even when doing something that makes you terribly afraid, always put on a smile on your face and pretend all is well, and then the thing you're doing will not feel so desperately daunting. James did just that. He plastered a smile on his face that made him in the darkness, with his pale white skin, look almost manic, like one of those demonic clowns you see in the horror movies. One brown and white rabbit was twitching its nose. It sniffed James through the chicken wire of the hutch and appeared extremely friendly. James looked at the cute rabbit cocooned in its safe little enclosure, surrounded by 19 other rabbits. He was suddenly struck with an attack of conscience that hit him like a fierce blast of lightning, as the little voice he'd been hearing all evening came rushing back and whispered warningly, "Don't do this, James! Don't do it! It's wrong!" "Simon," he said nervously, "are you sure we should be doing this?" He began to look around himself nervously, as if he expected to see the gargantuan figure of Mr. Lewis van Rensburg waddling out of the house, waving the cane in his hand he often used to help his ample form balance a little better. The man was so large it was difficult for him to move around without a little help. But if he carried on expanding at this rate, he'd end up in a wheelchair. James knew how irate Mr. Rensburg might become if he found his son's two best friends from next door fumbling around with their rabbit hutch at this time of night. If he was to see them, his booming voice would travel for miles around, for it was as large as the man himself, and extremely intimidating. "Of course we should be doing this," Simon whispered indignantly, his face almost becoming cross with his brother's inappropriate remarks that he didn't want to be hearing right now. He didn't need his brother's discouraging words to claw at his conscience and make him feel bad about what they were doing. Simon scowled at his brother. "Do you think it's fair we have 3 piddling rabbits that are stunted in growth, and that Boris has 20 sizable rabbits in his hutch? He doesn't need so many rabbits, does he? But our 3 could do with more friends. Why do you think there is such a thing as rabbit warrens? Rabbits like hanging around in large groups, everybody knows that. But try telling that to Mum. If Mum wasn't so tight, then we could have more rabbits, and we wouldn't have to be doing this. But she refuses to buy us any more, so this is the next best option for us. Anyway, Boris has far too many rabbits. Taking 2 of them is no big deal. But Mum thinks our 3 rabbits are more than enough for us to take care of. That's why she won't buy us any more," James insisted. "We've got 3 rabbits, James," said Simon sternly. "I may remind you that Boris has 20, and if he misses 1 or 2 rabbits, it's no skin off his nose. Besides, that mother of his will get him more, so he won't lose out anyway. You know what she's like. She's a complete pushover when it comes to Boris. He bosses his own mother around all the time, telling her what to do, and his mother refuses him nothing. He's a spoilt brat, that's what he is, and has his mother tightly wrapped around his big, fat, gluttonous finger. It's pathetic. Imagine if we spoke to Mum like he speaks to his mother. We'd probably be grounded from leaving the house for months on end, let alone weeks. Boris doesn't know how lucky he is to have a mother that gives in to his every whim. If our mother was like that, we'd have 30 rabbits, never mind 20, and a brand new rabbit enclosure that would outrival Boris's. Mum says Boris is spoilt and she doesn't want us becoming like him," said James. "I wouldn't like to be like him. He's smug, he's self-centered, he's lazy, he's conceited, and I don't think he even cares about his rabbits. He just likes being the kid that has everything, so he can show off to everybody." "There you go. That's all the more reason why it's not going to hurt Boris to lose a couple of his rabbits. In fact, it might teach him a good lesson, that sometimes even Boris can't have everything in life. Simon, don't you get it? That's the problem. Boris does have everything. Well, then I proved my point. If Boris loses a couple of rabbits, it's no big deal to him. He'll just get more, as I was saying." Simon was definitely not going to backtrack from this plan of his. He had thought about it long and hard. Boris didn't deserve to have so many rabbits, and it certainly wouldn't hurt him to lose 1 or 2 of them, as he kept reiterating to his brother James, who didn't seem convinced by his earnest persuasions. For Simon, listening to his brother harping on about the fact that they shouldn't be doing this, was not making things any easier for him. "But are you sure we should be doing this?" said James, repeating the same question all over again, somewhat robotically. The uncertainty was very discernible in his voice. "Think about it, Simon. What if Boris wakes up tomorrow morning and comes to the hutch and counts his rabbits individually, one by one? He'll notice at once that a couple of his rabbits are missing, and maybe he'll suspect us of stealing them. I would suspect us if I were him. He knows we are upset that he has so many more rabbits than we do. He also knows we're jealous. He said as much. I don't think we hid our feelings well. And we didn't hide the fact that we don't think it's fair he's got so many more rabbits compared to us. It didn't help, Simon, a couple of weeks ago. You asked Boris if he'd give us a couple of his rabbits, and he told us that no, there was no way he would ever do that." It wouldn't be difficult for Boris to connect the dots and figure out that we had a motive to pinch a couple of his rabbits. What if he demands to see the 3 rabbits currently in our hutch, and asks why we now have 5 instead of 3? 2 that he thinks look startlingly familiar. Maybe he will recognize the rabbits we've stolen from him. He probably knows all his rabbits, even though he doesn't name any of them, which is decidedly weird if you ask me. Oh, don't worry about that, said Simon, tapping his nose. I've thought of everything. Boris won't see our extra 2 rabbits, because you're right. He would recognise them. Then he'd accuse us of both being thieves. I think he will likely suspect we took them, but at least he won't be able to prove a thing. I'll put the 2 rabbits in the old hutch at the back of the shed, the one that Grandpa used for his pet guinea pigs. It's still functional, so we can hide our 2 rabbits we've taken in there. Boris, when he visits, he'd never go looking for the rabbits on the property. He's far too lazy and unfit. He's always getting out of breath, doing the slightest bit of exercise, because he's so fat. I bet when he gets to his dad's age, he'll be even bigger than he is. I just don't want the 2 of us getting into any trouble, that's all, said James apprehensively. Just imagine if Boris tells Mum 2 of his rabbits are missing. Supposing she suspects us of stealing them. Oh, don't be such a sissy, said Simon, snorting contemptuously at his brother James. I've paid you big bucks to come here tonight, so I don't expect you to complain. If it weren't for me, you could kiss goodbye to getting that vintage car model you want so badly. Besides anything else, you don't know what you're talking about. Mum would never believe we stole Boris's rabbits. She'll think the rabbits must have escaped from Boris's hutch and run away into the woods. She'd never think we pinched them. Never. Well, I hope you're right, Simon. You seem pretty sure of yourself. You're not paying me big bucks, by the way, said James in disgust. It's just a month's worth of your pocket money in savings, that's all. Well, it's a lot of money for me, and I'm giving it up to you so you can buy that vintage car. So quit complaining, will you? I'm not complaining, said James indignantly. I'm here, aren't I, doing what you asked me to do? I'm just saying, think about this idea of yours before you rush into things too hastily and start nursing regrets in the morning. I'm not going to regret doing this. I promise you, James, of that, said Simon insistently. Simon did not need his brother James reminding him that what they were doing was wrong. He'd rather not think about that. Life wasn't fair at the best of times, and sometimes it didn't do any harm to tip the scales of favour in their direction for a change. Boris van Rensburg had everything that money could buy, and more besides. It was disgusting how spoilt he'd become. These days their friend was like a greedy fledgling in a nest, with his beak permanently hanging open, waiting for it to be filled by 2 exhausted, overworked parents, who gave him all the biggest and fattest grubs he desired, that they struggled to get down his gullet. And even when he was stuffed to bursting point, he still seemed to want more. Because as far as Boris van Rensburg was concerned, he never had enough. The pastor at their local church would preach sermons about such people, mega wealthy corrupt billionaires in our society, who had acquired enough money to last many lifetimes, people who were involved in drug cartels and child trafficking, for example, but still wanted more and more wealth, for they were never satisfied with their iniquitous gains, for it was never enough for them. As far as Simon was concerned, the same could be said for Boris, although, if the truth be told, you couldn't really compare Boris to a corrupt billionaire. But even so, every year Boris's life appeared to expand, with more and more things in it, as much as his waistline did. It was hardly Simon's fault that his very ungenerous mother believed that he and his brother James had more than enough rabbits in their hutch, even though 3 seemed a pitiful amount compared to Boris, who had acquired 20 rabbits. It was the Miller family that had got their rabbits first, and when Boris had seen that Simon and James had acquired a rabbit hutch with 3 rabbits, the very next day Nina van Rensburg, Boris's mother, had brought Boris a much larger hutch with over 20 rabbits in it, as Boris loved to overshadow his two next-door neighbours. He liked to say to Simon and James, "Look at me! I've got a much bigger and more impressive hutch than you. It's much fancier than yours, and I've got over 20 rabbits. You've only got 3. Ostensibly, if the Millers got new bicycles, the very next day Boris would have a more expensive, fancier bike than theirs, even if he couldn't ride it. It was like he got some kind of macabre satisfaction from having better things than the Miller kids, and he enjoyed showing off. Simon didn't care about the material things that Boris acquired. It was the rabbits in Boris's hutch that made him insanely jealous, as Simon loved animals and wanted more than anything in the world to have more than 3 rabbits in their hutch, and had decided that 5 would be a very nice number indeed. Boris's nauseating mother Nina gave in to his every whim, and Boris seemed to enjoy having a mother he could easily manipulate. "My mother lets me have whatever I want. But your mum, well, she's really mean, isn't she? I'm so glad my mum isn't like yours." His words had hit hard, but it was true to a certain extent. Janice Miller was not exactly the most generous of mothers, whereas Boris's mother, Nina van Rensburg, was a complete pushover in every regard. She was like putty in Boris's hands, that he could malleably mould to do for him whatever he liked. Simon believed that Boris was like a self-entitled Maharaja in an Indian palace, sitting on his golden throne, waving his hand around as he ordered the servants. "I want 3 helpings of tapioca pudding, 5 Boston pies," he would lightly cry out, and the servants would adorn him with his heart's desires, refusing him nothing. Boris was useless at school, ate far too many Boston cream pies, along with ceaseless bowls of tapioca pudding, and as a result was constantly getting his clothes enlarged to accommodate his ever-expanding waistline. He was always getting ceaselessly praised by his mother Nina for being so pathetically useless and not lifting a finger around their house to help her. It wasn't fair that Boris got a huge amount of pocket money every week compared to James and Simon. He got 0 chores to do around the house. He didn't even have to make his bed in the morning, nor clear the mess up in his bedroom, and Boris was exceedingly untidy. He left messy puddles of clothes all around his bedroom, complaining bitterly that most of the clothes he wore were either too small or made him look fat, and Mrs. van Rensburg would run around him and tell him that no, of course he didn't look fat, and he was very handsome, and a young man at that, and not to worry, she'd buy him some new clothes that fitted much better. Nina van Rensburg was a tiny, rather nondescript woman, who was very slender and small-boned. She looked delicate in stature and size next to her oversized husband and son. Mr. Lewis van Rensburg was a big, burly man, of sizable proportions, who had once been a formidable wrestler, but had continued to eat the excessive amount of calories he once enjoyed when he was rippled with muscle and in the peak of fitness. So his huge muscles had turned into fat, and his face supported several chins that wobbled underneath his face, along with big rolls of blubber around his middle, and every year he appeared to get bigger and bigger and bigger. He always had to turn at an odd angle just to get through the front door. Simon and James had met him a few times, but he was always in a grumpy mood, and seemed to be somewhat aggressive in his behaviour towards the Miller kids when they came around to play with his precocious son. It was like he didn't like kids at all, and found them to be a tad annoying. Boris had confirmed to the Miller kids what they had suspected all along, and that was that Mr. van Rensburg had become somewhat crabby and bad-tempered in recent years, especially after he retired from wrestling, for he no longer had an outlet to let off his steam. Simon and James liked to keep their distance from Mr. van Rensburg whenever he was around, for his baritone voice would boom, and the whole van Rensburg house would wobble and shake under its mere vibration. Boris could be extremely rude to his mother, but she never batted an eyelid when he spoke to her like this. She would allow him to become a quintessential spoilt brat, who had become repugnantly overindulgent. It was pathetic to see how Nina van Rensburg idolized her son Boris, and dotingly put him on a pedestal, almost as if he was some kind of demigod, which Boris most certainly was not. Simon Miller was certain that Nina van Rensburg probably treated her husband Lewis in the same pathetically over-adoringly and doting manner as she did her son Boris. Whenever she came over to the Miller house for tea to spend time with their mother, Nina van Rensburg would harp on and on about how her husband had been the most formidable wrestler back in the day. It was like she was hanging on to those old memories of the past, as if they were still very current. She clearly still considered her husband Lewis to be a celebrity of note, that everybody should naturally adore, which was somewhat endearing. She would have stars in her eyes that would mist up with a wistful nostalgia when she talked fondly about the times her husband Lewis had done serious damage to some of his wrestling opponents, breaking noses and jaws and everything else besides. She seemed to relish talking about Lewis van Rensburg's accomplishments in this regard. She'd giggle like a teenager with a serious crush. "Lewis wasn't known as the grizzly bear for nothing, you know," she would say. "Everyone knew when they saw my husband that he could do some serious damage. Many wrestlers were completely intimidated by him before they even stepped into the ring, because Lewis had quite the reputation back then. And his body was so incredibly ripped. You should have seen the muscle on him. It was so impressive." "Did he now?" Janice Miller would say, a look of disbelief almost clouding her face, for it was impossible to believe that the beluga whale living next door could have fought anything. For these days Lewis van Rensburg struggled to walk to the front door without his stick for support. "Don't look so surprised, Janice," Nina would say. "I'll show you some fabulous photographs of what Lewis was like back in the day. He was an intimidating wrestler, let me tell you." "Now those pictures I would very much like to see," said Janice. "If he was as formidable as you say, Nina, it's sad that he doesn't do any more strength training these days. I'm sure it would do great wonders for his health, don't you think?" Nina van Rensburg sighed wearily. "Must we go over this again, Janice? You keep telling me that my husband needs to lose weight, but you don't seem to understand how difficult things are for him these days," she said, leaping immediately to her husband's defence. "Lewis's metabolism is not what it used to be. Back in the day, he ate a huge amount of food, and he burnt it all up, but not any more." "Nina, what aren't you getting about any of this?" said Janice. "I mean, of course he ate a lot of food when he was a wrestler. They all do. But if he's carried on eating as much food as he did back then, it's not his metabolism that is the problem. It's just that he's overeating. I mean, honestly, I don't want to be rude, dear, but I've bumped into you in the supermarket on many occasions, and I cannot believe the amount of food you put in that trolley of yours. That could feed my family possibly for 6 months or so. Is it any wonder that he's so fat, if you feed him so much? Honestly, Janice, I really would appreciate it if you didn't take jabs at what I buy in my supermarket trolley. It's no business of yours. I suppose I deserved that, Nina. I am sorry. Of course you deserved that. Anyway, I don't want to talk about my husband's weight. I find it very upsetting," said Nina defensively. "I was telling you about Lewis's wrestling days, wasn't I? And how he was known as the grizzly bear. And you so rudely changed the subject. Sorry, go on, Nina. When did you first meet Lewis?" asked Janice curiously, wondering privately to herself how a formidable wrestler such as Lewis, who was possibly a heartthrob back in the day, had fallen for such an unremarkable but very pleasant woman who had now become her close friend. Nina van Rensburg giggled again. She couldn't help herself. She loved talking about Lewis's wrestling days. "I knew when I saw my husband Lewis all those years ago. I simply had to go out with him," she told Janice proudly. "I'd never been interested in sports, you know, but when I was taken to a wrestling match with my brother Ivan, who was obsessed with wrestling at the time. I don't mind admitting I was secretly enchanted and overawed by Lewis's magnetism. Everyone in that stadium would watch him with wide eyes. His moves in the ring were so nimble, so effortlessly easy. He was so fearsome, let me tell you, and so incredibly big. And all the women, well, it goes without saying, they loved him to death. People would shout out Lewis's name in the ring and clap and cheer for him all the time. And I would watch him in a stupefied sense of admiration that I simply could not shake off. I went back with my brother Ivan to the stadium to watch Lewis wrestling a few more times. I was secretly nursing a rather pathetic crush on him, probably like every young woman around, who was imagining a life spent with the grizzly bear as much as I was. My brother Ivan thought I had become interested in wrestling, when nothing could be further from the truth. Although I did love watching Lewis, get into that ring. There was something about him that was just so incredible, let me tell you. Goodness gracious me, said Janice. It sounds as if Lewis was really quite a catch back in the day. Almost as if all the women in the stadium were practically drooling over him. Oh, believe me, they were. Drooling is the perfect word to use. I couldn't have described it better myself, said Nina, trying to suppress a giggle. Oh, my goodness, she said, patting herself with a tissue that she retrieved from her purse, for it appeared she had broken out in an excitable sweat, as she was reliving the romanticized dewy moments of her young life when she first laid eyes on Boris von Rensburg. It would seem a light went on in her face that made the very dowdy woman suddenly look quite beautiful. Oh, Lewis was so handsome in those days, Janice. You have absolutely no idea. When I would watch him, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, I would tingle all over, and there would be butterflies flying around my stomach. I was sure Lewis would never notice me. There were so many much prettier women than me that were unabashedly throwing their knickers at him. So one day I brought a pair of my own knickers along with me, and secretly put my phone number and name on them in permanent marker pen. I didn't believe for a second I'd have the balls to throw my knickers at Boris, but I brought them along with me nevertheless, and hid them in my purse, waiting for a moment when I could suddenly just become extremely bold and do something that I would normally never do. You did? Asked Janice, her lips twisting with amusement, as she tried to imagine Nina stuffing a pair of knickers in her purse in order to throw at the wrestler. Oh, I did, said Nina, chuckling. I was a lot bolder than I am now. I'd never do something like that today. My brother was in quite the shock, when he saw me throw my knickers at Lewis, who picked them up and winked at me. My brother was horrified and asked me what I did it for. I think I went as red as a tomato, and my brother said, "You fancy him, don't you?" He then cracked up laughing at me and told me quite plainly that Lewis would never be interested in the likes of me. He said that guys like Lewis von Rensburg had a plethora of supermodels lining up at his door, and he could have his pick out of all of them. I guess I knew my brother was absolutely right. I mean, why would Lewis ever have any interest in me at all, with my mousy brown hair and very dull brown eyes? I mean, I've always known that I was pretty mediocre and ordinary in the looks department. Oh, don't be so hard on yourself, Nina. Don't they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder? Said Janice encouragingly. Well, it's a very good thing that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, because obviously Lewis saw something in me. I think he must have needed his eyes examining. Imagine my surprise when he called me a day later, asking me out on a date. You should have seen me. I was so excited that this very big, handsome wrestler that all the women thought was a great big piece of all right was asking me of all people, out. I thought all my Christmases had come at once. When I told my brother Ivan the great news, he couldn't believe it. He thought I was teasing him and winding him up. but I assured him it was true. He said to me, "Lewis asked you out, but you're so ordinary. Why would the man be interested in you, when he could have the cream of the crop?" Mrs. Miller's jaws had opened wide at this startling revelation. She couldn't think of anything more smutty or sleazy than throwing your knickers at a wrestler, but she tried to hide her amusement and secret admiration that Nina van Rensburg had had the brass nerve and summoned up the balls to do just that. Certainly if the boot had been on the other foot, Janice would never have thrown her knickers at any man. Politely she said, "You shouldn't demean yourself like this, Nina. I'm quite sure you were a very attractive young woman back in your day. And you still are, of course," she said very quickly. "But as I was saying, men are unique as women are. They like very different things in women. One man might find a blonde woman with big breasts very appealing, very sexy. Another man might be repelled by such a woman, like someone petite, delicate, flat-chested, brunette perhaps. In my experience, men like women in all shapes and sizes. So one size most definitely does not fit all. And you were clearly Lewis's type. There is no doubt about it in my mind. I'm sure that what you say is true. But if I'm being honest with you, I don't remember a time that I was ever eye candy for the men. So what Lewis saw in me, I do not know. I was pretty mediocre, as I keep saying. So I thought that Lewis must be as blind as a bat, singling me out for a date, when he could have had any woman he liked." "So what exactly happened, Nina, when he called you?" asked Janice Miller, who always thoroughly enjoyed listening to romantic stories about how people met. She personally could not imagine Lewis van Rensburg ever being idolized by so many women, and she was sure, had she been in that stadium, she would have definitely not found the man attractive. But she didn't doubt Nina's story was true, so she kept these opinions to herself. Nina's face brightened as she recollected rather nostalgically her early dating life with her husband Lewis, and seemed to enjoy sharing some of her stories with Janice. "Well, he said to me on the phone, 'Is that Nina Starson?' And I said, 'That's right, it's she.' He said to me, 'I've got your knickers. Thanks for throwing them at me. Do you want to go out for a drink?' I said to him that would be lovely. He said to me, 'Were you the lady, the lovely, lovely lady, wearing the lime green dress with the pink daisies on it? I winked at you, if you remember.' I said, 'Yes, that was me.' And then he said, 'I've had my eye on you for a long time.' I realized then he knew who I was. And when we met up, I just knew he was the one for me, Janice. He told me that I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in his entire life. Can you believe that? When he said that, I'm telling you, I was in total shock, as no man has ever said that to me before or since. But he saw something in me that other men have failed to see. He proposed to me on our second date, would you believe it? I remember he went on the air talking about me on the radio and saying I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever beheld. So I think people were rather shocked when they saw me on his arm. I think they expected me to be a model, and I was anything but." "And you accepted his proposal after 2 dates?" asked Janice, looking decidedly startled. "I knew my husband for 3 years, you know, before we tied the knot. If he proposed to me after 2 dates, he'd have scared me away very fast. I was not going to rush into marriage, let me tell you, Nina. I needed time to get to know my husband first, before I finally knew we were right for each other. Call me old-fashioned if you like, but I've always been exceedingly careful about making any lifelong decisions. I've never been rash about anything. So I do envy you, Nina, for being bold enough to take the plunge in the way you did." Nina shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. "I guess the course of true love is different for every person. I knew I wanted to marry Lewis, so I accepted his proposal at once. When you know, don't you? I knew there were women out there that were jealous that I'd caught the golden carp. And, well, I was the happiest woman in the world. For weeks I walked around with a permanent grin on my face, and let me tell you, my jaws were aching from smiling so much. Wow! I've never had that happen to me. I can't imagine smiling so much that it hurts, said Janice. I can assure you, when I first met my husband, I had no idea he was the one. How did your brother react when he knew you were marrying one of his favourite wrestlers? He must have been as pleased as Punch. Mina van Rensburg chuckled. Well, when I told Ivan that Lewis had proposed to me, his eyes were as big as saucers, and were standing up on stalks, let me tell you. He said, "But you are so plain, so very ordinary. Lewis can have any woman he wants. He can't have chosen you. The man's insane. But I'm not complaining. It'll be cool having him in the family. They have been close ever since, you know. Although my brother's very upset that Lewis has let himself go, so to speak, and is no longer involved in wrestling. When he comes over to the house, he tells Lewis to come to the gym with him and resume training. But Lewis hasn't got the energy for that kind of thing these days. His slow metabolism has impeded him in so many ways. Your brother was dreadfully rude, if I may say so, said Janice Miller in disgust. I can't believe he said all that stuff to you, about being ordinary and plain, I mean. That's not a nice thing for him to say. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.